So welcome to Book Club. This is our last installment of our summer book club where we take a book of the Bible and we try to cover that whole book during our 30 minutes here together. We are going to close it out with the book of Esther, which is just a beautiful, epic story that is just fun to read, fun to tell, and think about. But we do want to highlight that Esther, like all the books that we've covered, are books within the greater book of the Bible, of God's Word. So it's one book of many that make up the Bible. And as we've tried to, week in and week out, highlight not just the book that we're reading, but the greater storyline of the Bible. We've talked about how you can describe this whole storyline of the Bible if you think of 4 words: creation, fall, redemption, and restoration. The creation of the world happens in the first pages of Genesis, right? Genesis chapters 1 and 2, we see the creation of the world. In Genesis chapter 3, we see the fall. The fall is when everything breaks, right? It's whenever Adam and Eve choose to follow their way instead of go God's way. And when they do, things fall and break, and we live now in the brokenness of this world. But there is redemption. In Genesis chapter 3, we have the first little peek at the Redeemer that's coming, the deliverer that is promised to be the offspring of Eve. And we look for that deliverer as we read through the rest of the Bible. But what happens after the garden is, right, Adam and Eve, they have Cain and Abel, and you have that story of the 2 brothers. And then you move into the story of the flood and how the wickedness on the earth grew up so much that God sent a flood. And so they have a restart to God's world and God's people. He tells Noah when he gets off the ark, here's what I want you to do. I want you to go out and I want you to fill the whole world, the whole earth, with my image. Spread out, fill the whole earth. Noah doesn't do that. He says, now, our people, they'd rather just settle in one area and build a tower and get ourselves up to God. It's called the Tower of Babel. God looks down and he says, listen, you're not doing what I told you to do, so this is what I'm going to do. I'm going to confuse your languages so that you can't communicate with one another, forcing you to spread out and to fill the whole earth with my image. Right after that, it's Genesis chapter 12. And what God does is he's moving through the storyline of the Bible is he shifts things at this point. He says, listen, this is what I'm going to do. I'm going to save the whole world through one man and his family, Father Abraham. I'm going to use him and his descendants to change this whole world, to bring my blessing to the whole world. We actually have that recorded in Genesis chapter 12, verses 1 to 3. We're going to put it on the screens, I believe, for you. And it says this: Now the Lord said to Abraham, go from your country and from your kindred and your father's house into the land that I will show you. And I will make you a great nation, and I will bless you and make your name great, so that you will be a blessing. And I will bless those who bless you, and him who dishonors you I will curse, and in you all the families of the earth shall be blessed. This is the formation of the Jewish people. Their father Abraham. God promises Abraham that he will have a people, a place, and a purpose. He promises he'll have a people, have descendants that are more than the sands of the seashore, right? He promises him a people. He promises him a place. This promised land, you read through the Bible, you'll see a lot about the promised land. But then he gives him a purpose. And if you were listening closely, then you saw the purpose that he gave to Abraham, where he said, here's your purpose, Abraham. In you, all the families of the earth shall be blessed. Abraham's purpose was to bless all the families in all the earth. Now, Abraham and his people have fallen short of that historically through the years, but that was the purpose of the Jewish people, that they would then bless all the families of all the people in all the earth. And so the story of Scripture is about God keeping his promise to Abraham and using Abraham's descendants to bring salvation to all nations. What does that have to do with the book of Esther? Okay, well, Esther takes place about 1,000 years after God and Abraham formed this covenant. It's been 1,000 years since these promises have been given, and the people of God are not in the promised land. The promised land's been invaded, and the people of God have been spread out throughout an evil empire. So where is God? Has he forgotten his promises? And that's the lead-in to the book of Esther. As we've talked about in previous weeks, the nation of Israel had its own little civil war where the north and the south separated, and we follow the history of the Israel in the north and Judah in the south. It was in 586 BC that the Babylonian Empire came and invaded the southern kingdom, killed off many of the people, and took the others back to Babylon. We have stories and books of our Bible about those people that were taken back to Babylon. But what we actually have here today in the book of Esther is someone who didn't live in the Babylonian Empire. Well, why is that? Well, it's because, as is the history of the world, one empire is stronger than the next. And so the Babylonians are conquered by the Medo-Persians. So the Medo-Persians come into power, and that is the setting for the book of Esther. It takes place around 480 BC under the Persian Empire's rule, specifically under what's called King Xerxes. In the book, he'll be referred to as Ahasuerus. It's easier to say King Xerxes. So the Jewish people are scattered throughout the empire. It's a dark time in their history. They're cast out of their land. Their people are spread out all over the place. Where is God? Why isn't He keeping His promises? He promised us a land. He promised us to be a great people. He promised us that we'd have a purpose, and I don't feel like any of that is being accomplished. As I look around me, where is God when we need Him? And that's the book of Esther. Interestingly, the book of Esther, God will not be mentioned in the book of Esther. It's one of the things that makes Esther stand out from all the other books of the Bible. God is not mentioned in this book. You won't find Him in it. Perhaps this setting draws us in. Perhaps you feel like God isn't showing up in your story. Perhaps you feel like God has made promises that are not being fulfilled. Perhaps you feel forgotten, like, why isn't God showing up in my story? Why would He allow evil? Why would He allow pain? Where is His mercy? If this setting draws you in, then you're ready for a really compelling story. Because this is the stuff that Netflix series are made of. It takes place in the king's palace, drama between kings and queens. There are assassination attempts. There are beauty contests. It's all kinds of wickedness would be displayed on your screen as you're binging Netflix. So it's an epic story. We'll tell you the story now. I know I don't need to tell you the story because you all read it this week. But it's just fun to tell the story, so you can listen along. So what happens at the very beginning of the story is we're introduced to the king. King Xerxes, or King Ahasuerus. He loves a party. He loves to drink. So he throws this big epic party where they're just drinking. He and all the boys, right? Because he has a giant boys club around him. All of his noble advisors for how to run the kingdom. They all just get together and get drunk. And they do it for weeks. Until finally the king's like, you know what? I'm tired of just hanging out with the boys. I'm going to call Queen Vashti to come over here. And I'm going to show off my beautiful wife to all of my drunk friends. Well, what happens is Queen Vashti says no. She says, no, I'm not going to be paraded in front of your drunk buddies. I'm not going to do it. I won't go. Well, this obviously throws the king into a rage, and he's furious that his queen is not doing what he told her to do. And he's mad, and his friends come around him and is like, you know what you need to do? You need to fire her. You can't let a woman talk to you that way. You got to fire her right now. And so he does. He fires her. You're not the queen anymore. Well, what are you going to do now? Well, I need to find a new queen. So he sends out a decree throughout all the land that all the beautiful young virgins would be gathered up, and from them he would pick his queen. We'll now enter into the story Esther. Esther is a Jewish orphan. Her family roots would go back to Israel and Judah, but her family were captured up in the invasion and taken back to live in Babylon. And then when the Babylonians were conquered, now the Persians are in charge. Esther's been living in a foreign land for as long as she can remember. Only family she seems to have is Mordecai. Mordecai's her cousin, older and taking care of Esther, so he feels responsible for her. He waits outside the king's gate every day, waiting, keeping an eye on Esther, because Esther is chosen. It says in Esther chapter 2, verse 7, she had a beautiful figure and was lovely to look at. And then in the next verse it says that she was taken into the king's palace. So we have to keep an eye sometimes on our children's stories, right? I've read the story of Esther to my children countless times, right? Like so many times. We have all the Bible story books. We read through them at bedtime. And as we should read them, but sometimes the story is presented as if Esther entered into a beauty contest so that she could win a prize at the end. Where if the Bible is putting these things as delicately as possible, it says in chapter 2, verse 14, again, the Bible is being delicate and saying, in the evening, she would go in, and in the morning, she would return to the harem. So it's not a children's story beauty pageant. It is a powerful king saying, I want young virgins gathered up for me. They can go through a year-long beauty process, and then I want to pick the ones that will come in and spend the night with me. And from that, then I will pick my favorite amongst all the beautiful young virgins that live in a kingdom. And that's how the story goes. Esther's chosen. She goes in, chapter 2, verses 16 to 17. When Esther was taken to King Ahasuerus into his royal palace, the king loved Esther more than all the other women, and she won grace and favor in his sight more than all the virgins, so that he set the royal crown on her head and made her queen instead of Vashti. Before that scene closes out, where Esther is now crowned queen, there's one little detail that the storyteller gives us. He says, now, before we shift, you need to know this. Mordecai would sit at the king's gate every day, trying to keep an eye on his cousin. But one day, he heard these two people hatching a plan of assassination of the king. And so Mordecai went and he got a message to Esther so that Esther would be able to alert the authorities so the authorities could stop the assassination attempt. So we just file away that little detail for later. The assassination attempt is stopped. You fade to black. A new scene begins. Years have gone by. Esther's the queen. And now a new character emerges into the story, and his name is Haman. Haman's a bad guy. However, Haman is elevated to second in command of the whole kingdom. Haman is so pleased with himself, right? He gets this promotion. He has ultimate power. He walks by places. People stand up and they bow down. He walks by the king's gate. People stand up and they bow down to him. But one guy doesn't. One guy won't bow down to Haman, and that's Mordecai. Mordecai refuses to bow down to Haman, which just infuriates Haman. But rather than just get mad at Haman, it reveals a real deep prejudice, hatred in Haman, and he says, this is what I'm going to do. I'm going to just eradicate all of his people. All of Mordecai's people. I'm just going to kill off all of them, all the Jews. Now, it's important to note that Esther has kept her nationality a secret. Ever since she went into the palace, she told no one that she was a Jew. But Haman knows that Mordecai is, and so he goes to the king, and the king, because he's genuinely a weak individual, he's not powerful and strong, he's a weak child, and he says, okay, Haman, whatever you want. Whatever you want. Haman says, well, they're these people that I want to kill off. I mean, they don't follow your customs. They have a whole different set of customs, so they really should be eradicated. And the king says, that's fine, man. Do what you want to do. So Haman sends out the decree to all the empire that on a particular date on the calendar, they're going to rise up and they're going to eradicate all the Jewish people throughout the Medo-Persian Empire. Once Mordecai learns about the plan and all of the other Jewish people living in the empire, they put on sackcloth and ashes. They rip their clothing. They start fasting. And they start weeping, mourning, because of the decree. Mordecai sends word to Esther. He says, Esther, these are your people. You got to help us. You got to go into the king. You have to beg for mercy from the king. You have to. And then Esther sends her reply back to Mordecai. And this is in chapter 4, verses 11 to 17. She's saying to Mordecai, all the king's servants and the people of the king's provinces know that if any man or woman goes to the king inside the inner court without being called, there is but one law. You'd be put to death, except the one to whom the king holds out the golden scepter so that he may live. But as for me, I have not been called to come in to see the king for 30 days. And they told Mordecai what Esther had said. Then Mordecai told them to reply to Esther, do not think to yourself that in the king's palace you will escape any more than all the other Jews. For if you keep silent at this time, relief and deliverance will rise for the Jews from another place, but you and your father's house will perish. And who knows whether you have not come to the kingdom for such a time as this. Then Esther told them to reply to Mordecai, go gather all the Jews to be found in Susa, and hold a fast on my behalf, and do not eat or drink for 3 days, night or day. I and my young women will also fast as you do, and then I will go to the king, though against the law, and if I perish, I perish. Mordecai then went away and did everything that Esther had ordered him to do. After the 3rd day of the fast, Esther goes, as she said she would, before the king's throne without invitation. She walks into her death. And the king holds out his golden scepter, and he says to Esther, you're my favorite. I love you the most. Whatever you want, just say it. I'll give you anything you want. Just tell me what you want. And she says, here's what I want. I want you to come to a feast. I've prepared a feast for you tomorrow, and I want you and Haman to come to the feast and eat with me and drink. So the king does. He and Haman attend, and the king is drinking again. This is a common theme with this king. He's always drinking. And so he's drinking again, and he turns to the queen. He says, listen, whatever you want, just tell me what you want. And she says, here's what I want. I want you to come back tomorrow. I want to do this again tomorrow. So the king says, fine. Haman leaves that party. He's on cloud 9. He's never been happier. He's like, this is amazing. Not only am I second in command, but now I have private audience with the king and the queen of the Medo-Persian Empire. There's nobody more important than me. I'm amazing. And then he walks by the king's gate full of himself, and he looks down and he sees Mordecai. And then he goes home and tells his wife and friends, this is the worst day of my life. Listen what happened. I went to a banquet with the king and the queen, and I'm the most important person in the world, but Mordecai's still at the gate, and he still doesn't bow to me. And his wife and his friends are just like, you're an idiot. Like, what is wrong with you, right? Like, you have the best day ever. What is wrong with you? He's just so consumed with himself, right? Consumed with hatred. So his wife says, listen, just kill him. Just kill him if you want to. He's going to ruin your life, so just kill the man. So Haman's like, oh, what a great idea. So Haman goes and he builds a gallows. He goes back to the palace because he's got to orchestrate things so that he can build the gallows that he will hang Mordecai on. Meanwhile, the king can't sleep. He's in his palace chamber. He invites one of his servants to come and read to him from his chronicles, read to him from what's happened in his kingdom under his rule. As they're reading to him, they tell him about this time, years past, when there was an assassination attempt that was stopped by a man named Mordecai. And he says, stop reading right now. What did we do for Mordecai? And they say, well, you didn't do anything. So he's like, well, we need to do something. Who's around? I need some counsel. Who's at the palace? And they say, well, the only guy out there is Haman, who's like actively trying to get the gallows built, right? So he calls Haman in and he says, listen, I got this problem. I got to figure this out. Please give me your counsel. And it's recorded because it's just so wonderfully written. It says, so Haman came in, and the king said to him, what should be done to the man whom the king delights to honor? And Haman said to himself, he's talking to himself here, well, whom would the king delight to honor more than me? So Haman said to the king, for the man whom the king delights to honor, let royal robes be brought, and the king, which the king has worn, and the horse that the king has ridden, on whose head a royal crown is set. And let the robes and the horse be handed over to one of the king's most noble officials. And let them dress the man whom the king delights to honor. And let them lead him on the horse through the square of the city, proclaiming before him, thus shall it be done to the man whom the king delights to honor. Well, then the king said to Haman, hurry, take the robes and the horse, as you have said, and do so to Mordecai the Jew, who sits at the king's gate. Leave out nothing that you have mentioned. So Haman took the robes and the horse, and he dressed Mordecai and led him through the square of the city, proclaiming before him, thus it shall be done to the man whom the king delights to honor. Then Mordecai returned to the king's gate, but Haman hurried to his house in mourning with his head covered. Runs into his bedroom, buries his head in his pillow, and then there's a knock at the door. It's the king's servant saying, Haman, come on, you're late. There's a feast. You and the king and the queen, you're late. Come on, Haman, let's go. So Haman rushes over to the feast. Well, as you might expect, the king is drinking again. And as he's drinking, he says, Esther, whatever you want, just tell me what you want. So finally, Esther's ready to say. So she says in chapter 7, verse 3, then the queen Esther answered, if I have found favor in your sight, O king, and if it pleases the king, let my life be granted for me for my wish, and my people and my request. For we have been sold, I and my people, to be destroyed, to be killed, and to be annihilated. If we had been sold merely as slaves, men and women, I would have been silent, for our affliction is not to be compared with the loss to the king. Then the king Ahasuerus said to the queen Esther, who is he, and where is he who has dared to do this? And Esther said, a foe and an enemy, this wicked Haman. Then Haman was terrified before the king and the queen. And the king arose in wrath from the wine drinking and went into the palace garden. But Haman stayed to beg for his life from Queen Esther, for he saw that harm was determined against him by the king. And the king returned from the palace garden to the place where he was drinking wine, as Haman was falling on the couch where Esther was. And the king said, will he even assault the queen in my presence in my own house? As the words left his mouth of the king, they covered Haman's face. Harbona, one of the eunuchs in attendance of the king, said, moreover, the gallows that Haman has prepared for Mordecai, whose word saved the king, is standing at Haman's house, 50 cubits high. And the king said, hang him on that. So they hanged Haman on the gallows that he had prepared for Mordecai. Then the wrath of the king abated. So that's a good end of the story there, but that's not the end of the story. Then he calls Mordecai in and he says, listen, I have an open position in my kingdom. The second in the command is now gone. So he puts the signet ring on Mordecai's hand. He says, now you're second in command. You have all of Mordecai's power and position. Well, right away, Mordecai and Esther turn to the king and they say, please, king, have mercy on the Jewish people. Please overturn this decree. Well, the king can't overturn the decree, but he says to Esther and Mordecai, whatever you want to do, do it. I'll sign off any decree that you make. So Esther and Mordecai put together a decree that says on that particular day that it's been decreed that you can annihilate the Jews, on that day the Jews can defend themselves. They can rise up against any army. They can rise up against anyone who desires to harm them or take their goods. So they spread this word throughout the kingdom. And it says in chapter 8, verses 16 to 17, the Jews had light and gladness and joy and honor. And in every province and in every city, wherever the king's command and his edict reached, there was gladness and joy among the Jews, a feast and a holiday. And many from the peoples of the country declared themselves Jews, for fear of the Jews had fallen on them. So that day comes, right? This day that's on the calendar when they're going to annihilate the Jews, but now the Jews can defend themselves. And this day comes, and the Jews strike down many of their enemies. You see, those who hated the Jews, they revealed themselves. They said, we're going to do it. We don't care about the decree. We are going to annihilate Jews because we hate them. So they exposed themselves, and then the Jews then annihilated them. So now at the end of the scene, the people that hate the Jews are now gone, and the Jews have peace and prosperity and are spared. The book ends telling how Mordecai went on to reign as second in command with honor, seeking the welfare of his people and speaking peace to his people. From this story, they have a holiday that is still celebrated today called Purim, where the Jewish people celebrate this amazing turn of events. Because it's this amazing story that has stood the test of time about how there could be this great reversal, how it looks like Mordecai is going to be killed. It looks like the Jews are all going to be wiped out, just when it looks like all hope is lost, just like when it looks like there is nothing that can be done to turn this story around, the king can't sleep. While God isn't mentioned in the story, if you start looking for his fingerprints, you begin to see them all over the story. It just so happened that one night the king couldn't sleep. And as he's read the Chronicles, he hears about Mordecai and the whole story shifts. God's providence and sovereignty are in this book. Though his name is not mentioned, you can see his handiwork, doing things that only he could do. Even when you can't see God at work in the story, he is still at work. Another theme that's important to highlight from this story is not just God's sovereignty in controlling all things, but his faithfulness. He is a God who keeps his promises. And though in the book of Esther we don't see him fulfilling his promise to return the people to their land, as it said he would in Genesis chapter 12, right? They'll have a land, it's part of the promise. There's a place for them. Well, that's not what this book is about, but there are others. The book of Nehemiah and the book of Esther or Ezra will tell us the story of God keeping his promise about a place. Now, I think what the book of Esther is about, as you think about Genesis chapter 12, verses 1 to 3, is it's God saying, listen, that covenant from Genesis chapter 12, in it I told you that you would be a blessing to all the nations. And so this is what I did. You sinned, and I allowed other nations to come and invade you and scatter you throughout the Babylonian Empire and now through the Medo-Persian Empire, so that I could put you in a position so that you could be a blessing to all the people and all the nation of the Medo-Persian Empire. This is a story of God saying, listen, I am a covenant-keeping God, and I am faithful to do what I said I would do. And what I want to do is I want you, my people, to flourish, and I want you to flourish, and as you flourish, I want you to bless those around you as you live in exile. And that's what the story of Esther is about, is his faithfulness. He was faithful to them. They thrived through the leadership of Mordecai in the kingdom. It says there was peace for them as Mordecai was ruling in the kingdom. And even on that horrible day when they rose up against the Jews, right? Did you notice in chapter 8, verse 17, it said, many from the peoples of the country declared themselves Jews. God's saying, listen, I will bless all the peoples of this earth. And there's all different ways I can do it. But that's my heart. And so what he did was he orchestrated the story so that many people throughout the land of the Medo-Persian Empire on this day said, you know what I'm doing? I'm jumping in with the Jewish people. I'm going to follow their God. I'm going to follow the God of Israel. I'm going to go that way. I'm going to go God's way with the children of Israel. Through the Jews, many people throughout the Persian Empire were blessed. As we think about applying this story to ourselves, I think we do need to remind ourselves God is working His will even when we can't see Him. In your story and in my story, God is working out His will even when I can't see Him. We have to believe that. And it requires faith, because we walk by faith and not by sight. Because I can't see God anywhere in my story, I have to remind myself in moments like this that I have to trust that He's working out His will even when I can't see it. We also have to be reminded as we read this story that God keeps His promises. Even when it looks like all hope is lost, God keeps His promises. And listen, there is a promise of a promised land. And it is in a day yet to come, God will gather His people, you and I, up into a promised land. And as we read through the New Testament, listen, we should think of ourselves as exiles. We should think of ourselves in this way. Listen, this world is not my home. I am not a citizen of the Medo-Persian Empire, and I am not a citizen of the kingdom of this world. I am a citizen of the kingdom of heaven, and I am on exile. I am not yet in the kingdom of heaven. There's a promised land that awaits, and one day I will be with my king, and we will reign there together. But in the meantime, I have been exiled to the kingdom of this world. And what has God invited me to do as I live in the kingdom of this world? He has invited me to be a blessing. He has invited me to bless those who are all around me in this foreign land that I live in. He's invited me to share with them the hope and the promises of God that can be theirs if they will join His people. I think there's all kinds of more applications we could get, but in the remaining moments, I do want to shift, because when we do book club, we talk about the setting and the plot of the story, but we also talk about the characters. And before time gets away from us, I want us to think about the characters in this story. And I want to frame it up this way. If you pay attention to the characters, you have some that have great power and authority, and those characters are described in ways that are foolish and evil. And you have other characters who have lesser degrees of power and authority, and they are presented as noble and wise. The characters that have titles and armies and thrones are often shallow and short-sighted. But those without as much visible power, the women, the exiles, the overlooked, they are the true heroes as they display courage and wisdom and faithfulness. It's fundamentally the story of the underdog. It's a reminder what it tells us in James chapter 4, verse 6, that God opposes the proud, but He gives grace to the humble. Think about the characters in the story. King Xerxes. He is impulsive. He is easily manipulated. He's an objectifier of women. He's always drinking wine. He's driven by ego and pleasure. We don't want to be like the king. Well, what about his royal advisors? All the people that hang out with the king. Well, we don't want to be like them either. They're quick to flatter. They're slow to speak the truth, and they encourage foolishness rather than restraining foolishness. We don't want to be like Haman. Haman's the worst character in the story, right? He's proud, vindictive, obsessed with his own personal honor. He's willing to destroy an entire people because one man ignores him. These are the ones that are powerful but shallow. They're politically strong but morally small. But those with little or no power are the heroes of the story. Look at Queen Vashti. She refuses to be paraded before drunken men regardless of the consequences. Look at Queen Esther. She's willing to risk her life for her people, and she is strategic and she is patient. She acts with great courage and wisdom. You look at Mordecai, a marginalized, exiled Jew. You'd think he doesn't have any authority. What can he do? Well, he's loyal. He sits by that city gate every day. He's discerning, and he's persistent in seeking justice. These people might be lacking in earthly power, but they are rich in courage and wisdom. You see, God works through those who are willing to step out in faith and take a risk. Those are the people that He uses to save the world. As we chase after authority, as we chase after power and position, God is trying to tell us, listen, I use the marginalized. I work through them. People who are willing to take a risk. As we try to apply this to ourselves, I think when you feel powerless, you're exactly where God wants you to be so that He can work through you. We have to learn to trust His unseen hand, even in our stories, and step into our moments with courage, understanding that there's great risk. But that's what we've been called to. That's if we want to be the hero in the story, that's what we must do. Maybe you're Vashti. Maybe that's who you are in the story. You're Vashti. Maybe you're stuck in a bad situation. Somewhere where you don't want to be, but you feel trapped. Maybe it's in a relationship. Maybe it's at work. Maybe it's in your family or your neighborhood or wherever it is. But you just feel like you're in an unhealthy situation that's outside of your control, and you're in a lose-lose situation, and you feel like you have no options. But when we look at Queen Vashti, we can be inspired and see like, no, you do have a choice. You always have a choice. And Queen Vashti chose to say like, no. I will resist evil, and I will stand up for what is good. And I will say no to abuse, and I will push back, and I will resist. And God can give each one of us that same measure of courage to say like, no, I will not be taken advantage of. I will not put myself through that again. Maybe you're not Queen Vashti. Maybe you're Mordecai. Maybe you're a person of integrity and honor and conviction, and you do what is right regardless of the consequences. That's an admirable character to be in the story. You refuse to bow to anyone other than God. You don't cower in fear. You stand with conviction. You don't follow the crowd. You don't just do what everyone else is doing, but you say, no, regardless of the consequences, I'll stand for what is right. And it would be nice if your story went like Mordecai's story. And sometimes it does. But I think we all know that oftentimes the Mordecais of the world are fired or martyred or ostracized. And so as we look at Mordecai, your story might not play out exactly the same way. Because if you're a person of conviction who stands up and does what is right regardless of the consequences, I'm not sure what will happen to you in this life, but here's what I know for sure. The King of Kings and the Lord of Lords sees you stand up. He sees your conviction, and He sees your courage, and He will reward you. It says in James chapter 1, verse 12, "Blessed is the man who remains steadfast under trial. For when he has stood the test, he will receive the crown of life, which God has promised to those who love Him." But maybe you're Esther. And maybe this is just a few of us. But maybe you're in a unique position to make a tremendous impact. Maybe it's in your friend group. Maybe it's in your workplace. Maybe you do have a position of power. And maybe if you spoke up, you could stop evil from spreading. Or you could stop gossip from spreading. Maybe if you spoke up, you could defend the weak and the vulnerable. Maybe if you spoke up, you could cry out for mercy for those who are being assaulted. Maybe God has orchestrated things so that you would have this unique opportunity that God has placed you in for this time and this place. But it will require courage. And it will require risk. And we have to be willing to lose everything. And we have to be willing to sacrifice our own power and privilege to advocate for those who have no power and have no privilege. And as we describe Esther, it should really remind you of someone else who did the same. It should remind us of someone who sacrificed his power and privilege of his heavenly throne to save those who couldn't save themselves. Because Esther is a beautiful foreshadowing of Jesus. We're told in Philippians chapter 2 that Christ descended right from His heavenly throne to become one of us, to be like us, and to die, to even go to the death on the cross out of His love for us. He was willing to risk it all to step forward. Therefore, God highly exalted Him and gave Him a name that is above every name, that at the name of Jesus Christ, every knee should bow on heaven and on earth, that Jesus Christ is Lord to the glory of God the Father. Esther should remind us of Jesus. Esther should inspire us to be willing to sacrifice our power and privilege for those who are under a curse of death, because that's what Jesus did for us. He sacrificed His power and privilege for those who are under the curse of death. But more than Esther, he was willing to die, and he did die. But now he reigns, and God has elevated him. As we wrap all of this up together, the book of Esther begins with God's people scattered, vulnerable, and seemingly forgotten. It plays out in a palace where powerful people appear untouchable, and yet they act foolishly. Meanwhile, the powerless people appear insignificant, but yet they act with courage and wisdom. And around every corner of the story, you see God at work. You see Haman brought down. You see Esther and Mordecai elevated. And in the end, not only are the Jewish people saved, but more people are now in the family of God than before the story started. Esther is not just a story. It is, but it is not just a story of a brave queen. Esther is a story about a faithful God. The God of Abraham, the God of Esther, and it is the story of Jesus himself. God keeps his promises. He protects his people. He fulfills his plan to bless all the nations. And he does it the Jesus way. Not through raw power, but through what looks like weakness. He does it through humility and sacrifice and courage. At the cross, Jesus left his palace, became poor like us, humbled himself to the point of death. And in that weakness, he brought the greatest victory the world has ever known. So when you feel weak, when you feel overlooked or powerless, remember, God is still writing his story. And in his kingdom, when we are weak, then we are strong. Let's pray together.